Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into one of the most haunting and misunderstood moments of the 20th century, the bombing of Guernica. But before we get to the flames and rubble, we need to understand the powder keg that made it all possible. Here's a question. How does a small town in northern Spain become the epicenter of global ideological warfare? The answer begins with a Europe on edge and a Spain already on fire. In the 1930s, Spain wasn't just having a civil war. It was being torn apart by a three-way ideological deathmatch. On one side, fascism, led by General Francisco Franco, back to the teeth by Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. On the other, communism, championed by the Soviet Union, throwing its support behind the Republicans. And caught in between, the idealistic, often chaotic dreamers of democratic republicanism, trying to keep a fragile vision of self-governance alive. Now, imagine Spain as a lab, but instead of beakers and Bunsen burners, it's tanks, rifles, and propaganda. The Spanish Civil War became a proxy battlefield, a kind of brutal rehearsal for the even bigger war looming just around the corner. And within this chaos sits Guernica, not just another town. It was a cultural heartbeat of the Basque country, an area known for fierce independence and its own rich identity. Strategically, it connected key supply routes. Symbolically, it represented resistance, tradition, and the soul of a people. That made it more than a dot on a map. It made it a target. And this wasn't just a Spanish affair. Foreign powers saw opportunity. Germany and Italy threw their weight behind Franco, not just to support fascism, but to test their newest military toys. The Soviet Union saw an opening to counter fascism and export its own ideology by backing the Republicans. Spain became a proving ground, a theater of experimentation, a place where future global tactics would be born, and civilians would pay the price. So when we talk about Guernica, we're not just talking about one bomb town. We're talking about the moment the world stopped pretending it wasn't involved. April 26, 1937. It was a market day in Guernica. Families gathered, vendors set up their stalls, children played in the streets. And then, out of a clear sky, came the sound of engines, followed by terror. This was no random bombing. It was a coordinated air assault, meticulously planned and executed by the Luftwaffe's Condor Legion, Germany's elite air force unit, and the Italian Aviazione Legionaria. Their mission? Simple, in the cold language of military strategy: destroy the town, break the people, and send a message. This was the first time in history that an entire town, without military significance, was systematically targeted from the air. We're talking high explosives, incendiary bombs, and waves of planes flying in shifts to ensure maximum destruction. Guernica wasn't defended. There were no enemy barracks, no weapons factories, just civilians, and they were the target. The bombs didn't just fall, they saturated. This was saturation bombing, a chilling military term that means exactly what it sounds like: drop so many bombs in such a concentrated area that nothing survives. Not people, not homes, not history. Estimates vary, but up to 1,600 civilians were killed. Many burned alive, many buried under rubble. Thousands more were injured, displaced, or traumatized for life. It was, in effect, a laboratory test in mass psychological warfare. And the horror wasn't a side effect. It was the point. Guernica was a turning point in aerial warfare. It showed what modern air power could do, not to armies, but to civilians. It wasn't just destruction. It was a warning to the world. And the world was watching. Now let's step back and ask, why Guernica? Why would powerful nations unleash this level of destruction on a small town in northern Spain? The answer lies in systems, incentives, and how ideologies turn people into pawns. To Germany, Spain was more than a civil war. It was a sandbox, a testing ground, a live-fire simulation for what they would later unleash across Europe. They didn't just want to win a war, they wanted to perfect it. Enter doctrinal experimentation. The Germans used Spain to fine-tune their most terrifying new tactic, blitzkrieg. Fast, overwhelming assaults combining air and ground forces, designed to paralyze an enemy before they could even react. And what better way to test these ideas than in a real war, where the risks are someone else's? But it wasn't just strategy, it was innovation through destruction. Think about that for a moment. Destruction as a form of progress. Authoritarian regimes, like Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, didn't view ethics as a constraint. In fact, they saw war as the perfect environment to try out new weapons, new formations, new ways of breaking human beings. If it advanced military power, it was worth doing, no matter the human cost. And why Spain? Because Spain was fractured, its government weak, its institutions collapsing. There was no oversight, no global watchdog, no meaningful resistance to foreign interference. This was operational freedom, the dream of every empire builder. A place where you could test your theories, drop your bombs, and walk away with the data. Guernica wasn't just collateral damage. It was a calculated move in the playbook of total war. And the systems that allowed it, they weren't broken. They were working exactly as designed. Guernica didn't end with Guernica. The techniques tested there, the cold, systematic targeting of civilians, didn't stay confined to Spain. They traveled, they evolved, and they set a dangerous precedent that would define the wars to come. What happened on that April day marked a strategic shift in warfare. Before Guernica, the idea, at least in theory, was that war was fought between armies. Soldiers met on battlefields, not in town squares. Civilians? They were supposed to be off limits. But Guernica flipped that logic. It showed that civilians could be the battlefield. And worse, it showed that breaking the will of a people could be just as valuable as defeating their army. And the world took note. The same tactics would reappear, on a far greater scale, in places like Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, cities that became infernos. Civilian casualties counted not as tragedies, but as calculations. Guernica was the blueprint. This global precedent shattered old moral boundaries. Suddenly, the rules of war weren't rules anymore, they were suggestions. Flexible, optional. And where were the laws? International agreements, like the Hague Conventions, hadn't caught up. They were written in a world of trench warfare and cavalry charges, not mechanized death from above. As bombs got faster, louder, more precise, law lagged behind. There was no Geneva Convention clause for saturation bombing in 1937. No one to say this crosses the line. So the line moved. And when lines move in war, they rarely move toward mercy. Guernica wasn't just an atrocity, it was a warning, and the world ignored it. Let's talk about what was lost. When bombs fall, we often focus on the lives lost, and rightly so. But there's another kind of destruction that's harder to measure. It's the kind that happens in the weeks and months afterward. The kind that tears at the soul of a community. Guernica wasn't just bombed. It was hollowed out. Economically, the town was crippled. Its markets, its supply routes, its infrastructure, obliterated. For a place that depended on agriculture, trade, and regional commerce, this was a death sentence. There were no banks to reopen, no goods to move, no fields to harvest, just ash and silence. But the damage ran deeper than the economy, because this wasn't just about destroying things, it was about breaking people. The bombing deliberately targeted cultural sites, churches, archives, homes passed down for generations. These weren't military assets, they were identity. When a town loses its records, its art, its sacred spaces, it loses something far more permanent than buildings. It loses memory, and that, right there, is psychological warfare. This was about erasing morale, making people feel small, helpless, shattered. It's hard to organize resistance when your neighbors are dead, your town is rubble, and your sense of self is burning. And here's the strategic genius, if we can call it that, behind it. Civilians weren't just victims. They were the target. The goal was to destroy their ability to function, to endure, to even imagine a future. This wasn't war as a clash of armies. This was war as psychological obliteration. And in Guernica, it worked. Now here's the part that should make us all stop and think. The bombing of Guernica didn't happen because a few rogue pilots went off script. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a battlefield miscommunication. It was planned, approved, signed off by men in uniforms and suits, sitting far from the smoke. And that's what makes it so chilling. This was violence born not out of chaos, but out of order, out of systems. It was centralized decision-making at its most efficient and most detached. A top-down command structure where decisions were made quickly, ruthlessly, and without dissent. Why? Because there was no room for dissent. In fascist regimes, disagreement isn't just unwelcome, it's eliminated. And that creates a machine that can innovate fast, but without brakes. Guernica showed us what happens when technology advances faster than ethics, when the means of destruction are perfected, but the moral framework to restrain them is left behind. You had cutting-edge aircraft, high-yield explosives, coordinated air formations, all of it fine-tuned to do one thing: destroy. And there was no one to say, should we? Only people saying, can we? In decentralized systems, power is scattered. Checks exist. Debate happens. But in centralized regimes, power is concentrated. Questions vanish. And in that silence, atrocities are not just possible, they're streamlined. Guernica wasn't a failure of control. It was control, unquestioned, unchallenged, and unleashed. So, what does Guernica really mean? It's easy to see it as a tragedy frozen in time, a horror of the past. But Guernica is more than that. It's a warning, a mirror, and a question. Because Guernica showed us what happens when technological power is centralized, when war becomes a science, and when people become numbers. It asked the world, what are you willing to ignore when it's not happening to you? And most of the world looked away. But Guernica also reminds us that the greatest threats don't always come from chaos, they come from control, from systems that reward obedience and punish conscience, from governments that innovate destruction faster than they consider its cost. And that raises the question, are decentralized systems, messy, slow, argumentative, actually safer? Can spreading out power prevent this kind of horror? Not perfectly, but maybe more effectively than placing the power to erase a town in the hands of a few men behind a desk. Guernica forces us to reckon with this. It challenges the idea that central authority knows best, and it calls on us, still today, to ask who is deciding, what they are testing, and who pays the price. Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. You can also check out the podcast version of this episode, links in the description. And if you enjoy thoughtful, unfiltered history that tells the deeper story behind the headlines, explore the rest of the channel. There's a lot more waiting for you at Truth Behind History.